Q4. Now, what's been really interesting and fun over the last couple weeks, we've been doing a lot of collaborations between Scaling Retail and embark.live, Makers Row, and certainly there's been a great deal of programming in terms of understanding what there is in the market, how you should be looking at your own collaborations, how you should be looking at your production cycles. And certainly my sections are all about looking at business strategy and how to be scaling up and growing your business. Now, what has been, I think, the most interesting thing to look at in these last few weeks has really been kind of the nature or the notion of, what's happening in the market, in the industry, and how are we looking at future projections or future forecasting. Today, Business of Fashion came out with a collaborative paper that was around what would it look like if we shifted our fashion cycles? What would it look like if we expanded our notion of deliveries? How can we produce garments and get products in the hands of consumers in a way that makes sense? Because honestly, guys, coming out of this crisis, what we're likely going to be seeing is a further push and pressure on brands to be able to satisfy delivery times and cycles that are going to be much closer to the selling period. So think of it like this. Currently, right now, it's May. People are wondering whether or not they're going to be going to market in June and July and August. And traditionally, those market time periods would be for spring, summer goods. We're also looking for resort, for holiday goods. So right now, the notion of a trade show is certainly kind of spun off, and there's some ambiguity there. However, when it comes to resort and holiday and spring, those delivery dates are actually much further out. You have your resort and holiday delivery dates coming in around October, sometimes November, and then obviously you have spring coming in around February, now these days later towards March. So it really bodes the question, which is, why must we have market that comes so much further in advance when the delivery dates are actually so much further out? Now that question really puts pressure on the manufacturing component. And when we're looking at how manufacturers are having to address this, it has to do with a lot of pressure on their production cycle. So if you think of it like this, your manufacturer needs, let's say, 6 months because they're working on delivery cycles from everybody, and they're batch producing things. And so depending on where you are in the queue, you have one factory is producing for lots of different brands. You might fall in the front half of that queue or on the back half of that queue. And so what standardizes the production cycle is the delivery date. It says, okay, brands, you all have 6 months to produce these goods. So the question then comes to mind, which is, what on earth are manufacturers going to be doing once we actually shift our production cadence and we start to look at deliveries and orders being placed closer to the time of delivery? And the reason why all this is important is today our conversation is around planning for a robust Q4. We are going to have a very interesting and robust Q4, and how should you be looking at planning that business? So let's unpack some of the considerations that you might need to be making today. Now, the first consideration is obviously, how are you going to be looking at, your wholesale purchase orders, for example? If you are right now, if you had cancellations for your spring 2 deliveries, maybe right now your fall 1 deliveries are kind of in threat. You're unsure whether or not you'll be delivering. This is going to be a really good time for you to take a look and kind of get back in touch with your wholesale retail counterparts and actually find out how their buying strategies are going to be shifting, or their inventory or purchase order management strategy is shifting for the beginning of Q3, end of Q3. The one thing you're also going to want to keep in mind, guys, are what do you have in terms of inventory on hand? Certainly, there are going to be products right now that are going to be more immediate. Now, those products may not fall into the category of things like resort, or they may not fall into that traditional holiday category. But this is the time to be asking yourself, what is it that I can possibly carry over into the fall winter season? And also, what is it that I maybe access in a capacity in order to produce quickly and in order to shorten my production and development timeline in order to produce more with more agility and less inventory risk? Now, this is a question that I actually encourage all of my clients and all of the brands that I work with to be looking at in a very consistent basis. When you're starting to ask yourself about production timelines and delivery cycles, more often than not, you see the direct-to-consumer brands that have more ownership over this having less of an issue. Direct-to-consumer brands are not adherent to traditional fashion show cycles. They're also not the ones who are trying to get purchase orders in advance. They actually have their own schedules, their own cadence, and then they look at wholesale and that retail model as an additional layer onto that existing direct-to-consumer model. So the direct-to-consumer is the focus, and then you have additional wholesale retail layering on. However, the brands that have been doing the bulk of their bread and butter through the wholesale distribution model are the ones who are going to have to come back and say, did I actually protect or kind of scale my business in the right way, or must I need to now take a look and say, how can I better recession-proof, consumer-proof my distribution cycles and create a model that is not only going to help work with retail, but also going to really fuel your own direct-to-consumer models. And I do believe that through every single crisis or recession or issue that we've had from an economic standpoint, we've seen a lot of brands look to innovate in terms of how they're looking at their business models and also how they're looking at distribution, supply chain, inventory management. So all of that really needs to get put onto a lens. And to be honest, the fact that we're now looking at that once again from a fashion cycle standpoint, I would have thought, right, coming out of 2008, that we would have been able to make some adjustments there. But we did for a little bit of time, right? Remember what happened in 2008. Housing crash happened, banking crisis happened. All of a sudden now we had the influx a few years later, direct-to-consumer brands cutting margins, going direct to consumers through e-commerce, and also opening up brick and mortar locations. And then we also saw the introduction of outlets. So the outlet business, right, what was, mincing my words here, what was originally a cycle in which you had brands that were overproducing, right, which ended up with all this excess inventory, you then saw a huge pullback, and all of a sudden brands that are producing a lot more leanly. In addition to that, you then also saw them producing made-for-outlet product, right? How many brands actually had collaborations with Barney's in their made-for-outlet division, right? Their made-for-outlet stores. So not only did we see inventory being pulled back, we also saw introduction of new revenue streams in order to be producing for those channels as well. So at that time, right, back in 2008, there really weren't this whole notion of influencers, right? There wasn't this whole concept of social media driven editors or social media driven anything, right? 2008 was really still focused on traditional fashion shows, right? You still had a lot of the cycles of the fashion industry running at the same speed. It was really more of an issue on how do you understand the supply chain? How do you understand inventory management and buying? But the industry from an external standpoint pretty much looks the same. So today what we're talking about, right, now that we actually have some cultural shifts and changes vis-a-vis Instagram, looking at Pinterest, looking at this influencer model, now we're looking at this from a very different perspective, because not only do we have a back end shift that needs to happen, excuse me, but we also have a front end shift. So on this front end shift, what you're looking for is how are we actually changing the way consumers are going to be consuming product? Again, very different from the notion of how are you going to get how are you going to change the supply chain in the back end in order to fulfill and work on the relationship with retailers and less inventory. Now it's more to the degree of what's the point of a fashion show, right? What is the point of creating these, what used to be buyer-driven models that are now consumer and influencer-driven models? What is the point of that, right? Questions are now coming under scrutiny in terms of, do we actually need to be traveling or flying as much, right? In this article today, they talked about merging men's and women's fashion weeks. So I think there needs to be, honestly, as we look at what's happening on the back end in terms of supply chain inventory management, and then also on the front end in terms of the role that fashion in the industry plays to consumers, we have to ask ourselves, how do we make incremental changes that keep into consideration all of these components as we're emerging emerging out of this crisis, right? This isn't just a future forecasting, hey, wouldn't this be nice? This becomes more of the truth of how are we going to be managing in the next 3 months? What I'm anticipating is going to be a very robust Q4. So how on earth are we going to do that? Let's talk about that a little bit. If you are a small to medium-sized brand and you are currently right now evaluating your supply chain, you're making significant changes, markets are opening up. I know factories in Portugal are opening. Some factories in the States are still producing samples, and they're starting to look at opening up in a more robust way as well. These become really important moments for you to have conversations with your factories. This is where relationships become a huge component. So taking a look not only for your own production cycles and saying, what are my existing wholesale retail counterparts? How can I start to partner up with them? How are they looking at shifting their buying strategies? And how might I be able to, as a brand, back into those strategies, right? Very, very important. If you're able to back into those strategies and able to work with your retailers and subsequently negotiate and work with your factories, guys, and all of a sudden you have yourself a much more smooth supply chain that's going to be able to work with those needs. I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of smaller brands coming together in terms of opening and working on their own manufacturing capabilities. The need to own your supply chain is going to be more important now than ever, especially as we're looking to stay lean. So what happened was once the economy started to rebound in a much more robust way, we then turned back towards overproducing with high amounts of inventory. And why else do we think we're having such huge issues across, very significant markdowns and POSs right now? Mismanagement of inventory based on what we were seeing trajectory-wise is very healthy consumer spending. Even before this crisis happened, we were still looking at a potential recession, but we weren't looking at anything as significant as what we're experiencing now. Okay, so looking at your own supply chain, understanding whether or not you have the capacity to own more of manufacturing, own more of your supply chain, getting in touch with your retail counterparts to find out how they're shifting their buying strategies, and actually finding out from them how are those Zoom shopping experiences going with customers. Curbside pickup is now opened up in Los Angeles. Finding out from them what products and how are you now actually going to be able to read future demand based on how consumers are now starting to reopen and shop. So things are kind of moving in a very agile and quick way. Other things to be planning for Q4 is when we're looking at not just on the consumer side, people are going to be shopping again, you're also going to be looking back on the employment side. And so one of the things that I find most important to stress right now is this is an amazing time to be able to get a hold of labor at a very great rate. You want to be able to find the right talent who's going to add such a high amount of contribution to your business. But you're also wanting to find out, I'd say at the same time, with that contribution, how am I actually looking future forecasting for my business? So Q4 should not only be, a high time in sales, but also in terms of coming back to full capacity as an internal organization. Right now, it's challenging. A lot of feedback I've been hearing is it's difficult to hire right now. Why is it difficult to hire? So many people are unemployed. It's difficult to hire because right now, not only is the majority of the US public getting extra benefits on top of unemployment, but they're also getting their own kind of personal stimulus checks, right? Of $2,400 for a couple, $1,200 per person. And so what we're finding is kind of within the economy, the moment that the PPP, that payroll protection loan, the moment that kind of dries up, which should be in about another month and a half or so, you're still going to have a labor force that's going to be readjusting until those benefits run out on unemployment. So what we need to find here, guys, is kind of where by that time, which businesses are still going to be around to hire back a new labor force. So if you have the capacity now to start to make those key strategic hires, it's ultimately going to help you as you're looking to stay agile between now and Q4 when you're going to see sales really tremendously pick up. Other things to be considering for fall, winter, and for holiday sales. Number one, this is definitely the time to be looking not only into what you're currently producing and manufacturing, but also the key categories of things like private label. I think oftentimes we turned a blind eye to private label. We don't like to know that it exists. We don't talk about it very often. I don't think there are a lot of just regular consumers listening to this, so it's still a well-kept secret for us in the industry. But private label, I think, is one of the areas that I actually find to be the most exciting in many ways. One, because you own less of it. You're able to kind of negotiate with people who are producing the products. You develop long relationships. You don't have to worry about design and development, and you can back into trends pretty easily, right? If you're working off of private label channels, which I actually like quite a bit. And asking yourself for Q4, right, as we're looking at the reporting coming in from WGSN, what are some of the key trends and components in giftables? How are we looking towards more of a self-care and wellness market? And how might your brand, which maybe was only known for dresses, how might your brand actually be able to expand into something that is if your Facebook is actually, sorry, I just got a notification on Facebook. If your collection is actually able to expand to be able to, house some other lifestyle products. And so honestly, I think that ends up being one of the most interesting or important things, right? Here's your brand. Here is your brand on COVID. We don't know where it is, where it's going. You might have some key products that have developed some core focus or your core bread and butter, and how might you be able to expand your brand and look for key products that are within the right lifestyle components of your brand. So at Scaling Retail, we do something really interesting, which is when we do customer market interviews, what is so amazing about those interviews is we actually end up finding out from customers what are the key benefits and features of your products that they're actually buying from you. We might think that they're buying for one reason. I gotta tell you, most designers out there think that it's because of the style and the aesthetic. Most marketers out there think it's because of the language that they use. And most of the creative directors think it's because of their photo shoots. But ultimately, until you go through these kinds of very hard, and long customer interrogations and customer interviews, are you actually able to take a step back and say, okay, these are the things and the reasons why my customer is shopping from me? I would say that about 100% of the brands that they're listening today have not gone through customer interrogation and customer conversations with quite as much depth as needed. And what you might end up finding out is that your customers are actually buying from you for very different reasons than you think they are. And I would say that the biggest issue in terms of how you're looking at the development of your collections go forward is not just going to be based off of what the design trends are or based on what your head designer thinks is going to be next. It's actually going to be based on more customer-based conversations. It's going to be based on more of these marketing conversations around original intent on purchasing. Why was today the day that they decided to purchase from you? Why do they keep coming back? And guys, if you are not planning on investing in that kind of customer research, then your brand has a very small percentage chance of being able to actually continue to survive and thrive over the next coming years. So one of the things that we've been doing with the brands that we work with are doing these jobs to be done interviews, making sure that we truly understand the real motivations and purchasing intent and purchasing power, and providing our clients with the opportunity to pivot or pursue based on the information that we're getting. There hasn't been any information that we've received that hasn't positively impacted a customer and brand experience. Why? Because now all of a sudden, you're not just saying, what are the things that I find to be the most interesting, right? What are the things that I think are going to work? But you're actually saying, okay, what do the customers actually really want from my brand, right? How am I actually iterating and developing something that is truly based on customers' needs? All right, guys, so planning for a robust Q4 not only needs to be something you look at in terms of inventory management, your supply chain. Obviously, it also needs to be something that you're looking at in terms of how you're managing your internal operations from a capacity building standpoint. Please get on that today. Very, very important. And then you're also looking at, guys, how are you iterating your product? How are you developing and furthering your brand in a market right now where the majority of brands are suffering in many ways? So very important things to consider, guys. That's all for me today. Once again, I'm Syama Meagher. I am the CEO of Scaling Retail. We are a international retail consultancy. We work with brands all over the world to launch, scale, and get them the right visibility, connecting the right products to the right customers at the right time, which is, my gosh, an old saying from, I remember from, geez, what is it, like back in 2002, I remember hearing that for the first time. All right, guys, that's all for me. Please come find me on Embark Live, on Maker's Row. Once again, it's a pleasure to be here with you on a weekly basis. And remember, when it comes to pivoting or pursuing, it's always best to arm yourself with the greatest amount of information that you can. The only way to be successful is to be an open mind. And one thing I always tell people is, would you ever take advice from your 18-year-old self? Chances are no, you wouldn't. So don't do it in business. Don't do it in your personal life. Continue to be open to pivoting or pursuing on strategies. And remember, Q4 is right around the corner. You have a great opportunity today to set yourself up to succeed. All right, I'll talk